Welcome to the HIT Podcast, H.I.T, Human Resources, Insurance, and Technology. I'm your host, Toby Kennedy. As we do every week, we are dropping into your feed with what I hope are bite-sized, digestible, super awesome conversations going on in the space. This week's episode will be no exception. Getting into it quickly, this week's episode is brought to you by Montage Insurance Solutions. And without any further ado, I bring to you the authoritative video on calculating employer size per the Affordable Care Act. Now, if you got a tickle in your throat as you said that, it's because you're thinking authoritative. Well, listen, laws can change. Disclaimer, disclaimer, disclaimer. I'm some dude on the internet. Disclaimer, disclaimer. Talk to your attorneys or benefits consultants or whatever. Disclaimer, disclaimer. Now, that being said, spoken on this hundreds of times. As you guys that follow me probably know, I've been in the space for a couple of decades. This video will be a brief video that will talk to you about how do you calculate employer size relative to the Affordable Care Act, applicable large employer, the ALE, the provisions, right? So, hey, the Affordable Care Act said to the insurance companies, you got to do some things. To human beings out there, you got to do some things. And it said to employers, you got to do some things, right? Get this type of health insurance or fill out that type of form, whatever. But not every employer does. And some of the big employers know, yeah, we're big. Some of the small ones know we're tiny. But there's a lot of folks in the middle, we're tiny. There's a lot of folks in the middle that are like, yo, I don't know exactly where I fall in this. So that's who I want to talk to today. I want to just spell out how the Affordable Care Act concludes whether or not you're an ALE or an applicable large employer. So we're into a new year. You might be thinking to yourself, gosh, we've got growth plans or we're doing really well. We're going to hit 50 this year, right? So let me just unpack it. First and foremost, the Affordable Care Act says you are an ALE or an applicable large employer if you've got 50 or more employees. There's a bunch of caveats, so don't tune out yet. 50 or more employees, okay? So if you're an employer that's got 50 or more employees, you have to do all of the 1095, 1094, all of the, you got to get your health insurance to the right actuarial value. You got to pay the right amount of premium. You got to do all the employer shared responsibility provision things to avoid all the different penalties, right? But if you're under, you don't need to do any of that. In fact, if you're small business enough, you might qualify for a small business tax credit to buy health insurance you might want to look into, but you don't need to do the forms and you don't need to buy certain insurance. So let's get into how do I figure out whether or not the government's going to come knocking and say, you do need to do these forms, which are kind of annoying. So if you don't have to, you don't want to, or you do have to buy this type of insurance or pay this much towards it, et cetera, right? Here you go, 50 employees. Now, when they say employees, they're talking about full-time employees, FTEs, and full-time equivalents, okay? So what they mean by that is all of the hours worked by my part-timers kind of amalgamated together and divided out evenly to sort of become the equivalent of a full-time employee. In other words, if I had 2 employees that I had working 3 hours a day, Monday to Friday, 15 hours a week, those 2 employees, 15 hours, they're both part-timers, clearly part-timers, right? They only work a few hours a day. But those 2 guys combine to make 30 hours a week. So those 2 folks combine for 1 full-time equivalent, right? So if I had 49 full-time employees, everybody's here Monday to Friday, 8 to 5, they are full-timers, and I had these 2 folk, as far as the healthcare reform bill is concerned, I don't have 49 employees, I have 50, because I've got the 49 full-timers, and I've got the 1 full-time equivalent, right? So I got to add those guys in. So I'll get into the math in a moment, but when we talk about how many employees you have, we're talking about full-time plus full-time equivalent. Now, to figure out the math on that, you can set your genuine full-timers aside, okay? And this is a calculation, by the way, that you do every month on a month-by-month basis. Do it in January, figure out how many employees do I have, full-time plus full-time equivalent. Do it in February, figure out how many employees do I have, full-time plus full-time equivalent. March, April, May, et cetera. You do this for the full year on a month-by-month basis. You total all that up and divide it by 12 to see, okay, on each monthly basis, when I looked at full-time plus full-time equivalent, what was the number of employees I had? Maybe in January, that number, full-time plus full-time equivalent, was 40. And in February, it was 40. But in March, it was 45. April, May, June, it was 50. And for the rest of the year, it was 60, 75, right? So when I average that out, even though I started the year under, how did I finish the year kind of in toto on average? Any year that you are in, you're doing the calculation, it's to figure out if you need to start considering yourself in ALE in the next calendar year. So for example, right now filming this, we're in 2025. If you entered 2025 and want to know if you're an applicable large employer, you can do this calculation for 2024. What did I have in January, February, March, April, May, et cetera, all the way through December? Look at that and see. And if that number is less than 50, you're not an ALE for the entire calendar year of 2025. You don't need to worry about that, because some folks tell me, hey, Toby, I've been at 45 employees. I'm going to crack 50 by June or July. We've got growth. That's okay. If you weren't an ALE last year, you don't need to worry about this calendar year. Now, this calendar year, if you have so many employees on this month-by-month calc that you end up with the average in 2025, as you know, your month-by-month basis, you're averaging more than 50 employees, then come 2026, you need to start considering yourself an applicable large employer, right? So for the purposes of the 1095, 1094 forms, because those are a look back, you would wind up doing these in 2027, January of 2027, for the calendar year of 2026, because you did the calculation in 2025, right? So what I'm saying is, in any given year, if you weren't an ALE in the prior calendar year, you're not an ALE in this calendar year. So now we'll get into how we do the calculation. 30 hours per week, or 130 hours of work in a month, that person's a full-time employee, okay? So you count all those people, and then you set those people aside. Then you look at all of the rest of your population, right? It's all your part-timers, because I just identified my full-timers and I set them aside. You look at all the hours worked by all those part-timers. So look at every single human being that you did not call a full-time employee. Look at all the hours worked by those people. Do not count any hours more than 120 to any given individual. So look at all the hours worked by those people, but if one guy worked 125 hours or whatever, you just count 120 hours per person. That's the most they can count towards this total. You take all those total hours and you put it in a big bucket. You divide that by 120, right? That's the calculus that the legislation spells out. So I look at my full-timers. I set my full-timers aside, those guys that work 30 hours per week or 130 hours in the month. Then I look at who's left. Those are all my part-timers. And now from that batch of part-timers, I need to figure out my full-time equivalents. Okay, so I'm going to take all the hours worked by those folks, again, not giving any one person credit for more than 120. I'm going to add all those hours up for all my part-time people, and I'm going to divide that by 120. Okay, that number is going to be my full-time equivalent, okay? So if I had a scenario where I had, again, let's say 40 full-time employees, but I had so much part-time labor that when I added up all my part-timers' hours, I divided by 120, I found out, gosh, I've got 11 full-time equivalents. As far as the legislation is concerned, that month, I had 51 people. And if that happened every month, all year long, then by the end of the year, I averaged 51. So for the next year, I need to know I'm an applicable large employer. Now, that employer then looks at me and goes, yeah, but I had 30 part-timers that accounted for that 10 FTE or 11 FTE, that full-time equivalent. Do I just randomly pick my favorite 10 or 11 people? Like, who do I give the insurance to? And it's like, no. Figuring out full-time equivalents, taking your part-timers' hours, dividing it by 120 is strictly to determine whether or not you're an applicable large employer. If you're an applicable large employer, then the only people you're responsible for rolling out the health insurance to are your genuinely full-time people. Okay? So when you find out you've got 40 full-timers and 11 full-time equivalents, you don't need to find 11 people to also have to offer health insurance to. It's just your full-time employees. Okay? So again, we do this on a month-by-month basis. We look at our full-timers plus our full-time equivalents. We look January, February, all the way down. At the end of the year, we figure out, okay, on a month-by-month basis, what was my employee count? I use air quotes for employee because it's employee plus full-time equivalent. on January, February, March, all the way down. I divide that total number by 12 to figure out my monthly average of employee count. And that, again, will always include the employee plus the full-time equivalents. If that figure makes me an ALE, if that figure is 50 on average, then in the next calendar year, I'm an applicable large employer. And all the things that come with the healthcare reform bill befall me. All of the forms and mandates and all the other things. We've done other episodes on those. This was just to help you figure out whether or not you are an applicable large employer. So thank you for sticking in the pocket with me as I drill down to this specific segment of the legislation, because it applies to all those guys that are kind of in the middle, right? If you've got 3 employees, you know darn well you don't have 50. If you've got 3,000, you know darn well you got more than 50. But for a lot of groups that are kind of in the middle, you've got a few dozen people and you've got some part-timers, this is the way that you do the math to figure out whether or not the healthcare reform legislation applies to your company. And now you got to start paying attention in the next calendar year. That's all the time we have for you on this week's episode. Our sponsor is TrueHue. Thank you guys so much. TrueHue is awesome. Thank you guys for watching. Appreciate it. Join us next week. Join us every week. And until next week, make this the best week yet.